everyone, welcome to a special webinar brought to you by U.S. Heartland China Association and the Carter Center. My name is Min Fan. I'm the Executive Director of U.S. Heartland China Association. The topic today is a reset U.S.-China relations possible in 2023? I want to thank the Ford Foundation, Henry Luce Foundation, and Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support of our work. With that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Yawei Liu at the Carter Center, also a board member of U.S. Heartland China Association, to lead us through the rest of the session. Dr. Liu?
Thanks, Min. Thank you, Susan and Ryan, for agreeing to participate in this very important discussion. You know, we're at I don't know whether we can use the word critical or vital moment, in terms of U.S.-China relations. But before I'm going to ask you to get started, I want to let our audience know that neither Susan nor Ryan need an introduction, because you all know them well. And I remember when I saw the picture of Susan and Secretary Tillerson in Beijing, meeting with Xi Jinping, I said, wow, I know that lady. I know her as early as 2005 when she traveled with a Carter Center group, to observe elections. Looking back at then and compare it to now, looks like that's a, in the Chinese word, 解放前,解放后. This is kind of like a before liberation, after liberation type. Ryan, I first met Ryan when he came to our meeting in January 2019. We were the only organization in the U.S. to commemorate the 40th anniversary. Ryan has a lot of titles, but the best title I like is the 古政府 Chair on Taiwan Studies. I think of all the people who are looking into Taiwan issue and how that is impacting U.S.-China relations, Ryan's study is the most important and most impactful. So without further ado, as we have discussed earlier, we'll go to Ryan first to offer his insight on where this relationship is now and whether a reset in 2023 is possible. Ryan.
Well, Yawei, thank you for such a kind introduction, and also thanks to Min for the opportunity to join Susan in this conversation. I'm really most interested in hearing what's on the minds of our colleagues, the members of the Heartland China Association. But I understand that my price of admission for hearing those views is to share a few of my own. So I will try to be deliberately brief in offering a few initial framing comments and then turning it over to Susan. My goal is to try to provide a bit of a framework for how to think about the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship going forward. And the place where I start in thinking through this is trying to put ourselves in the shoes of China's leaders to see how they are seeing things. And my impression is that President Xi would like to be remembered as the leader who made China strong. I think he believes that China has become too strong externally and internally to placate external anxieties about China's rise. And as a result, China just simply needs to plow through obstacles to become strong enough so that the rest of the world adjusts to and accommodates China's position at the center of the world stage. The cost or the challenge of this approach is that it arouses anxieties about the implications of China's rise, which we are seeing in the United States and elsewhere. And I think that part of the Chinese leadership's answer to this has been to work to try to fortify their own domestic economy, including by really emphasizing the need for self-sufficiency and self-reliance. But as all of us who have studied economics know, self-sufficiency and self-reliance are not inexpensive, they're costly, they're inefficient. And so President Xi is trying to push China's economy in this direction at the same time that its economy is slowing down. And really, this is the first time since the 1980s when the size of the economic pie of China is not growing rapidly. And in fact, it's slowing down quite considerably. And there are a number of factors for this, from an aging population to worsening dependency ratios, shrinking and more expensive labor force, ballooning corporate debt load, and just sort of a less hospitable external environment for China's rise. And so leaving aside for the moment the question of how the ongoing protests about zero COVID inside China will unfold, I think that China's leaders already are going to confront some pretty hard trade-offs. You know, in the United States, we talk about the trade-off between guns and butter, but you know, economic, budgetary trade-offs. And the sharper that these trade-offs become, the greater the risk there is that differences between top leaders around their respective priorities will spill out into public view. And just to be clear, I'm not predicting any type of doom and gloom, but I do think that China's economy is going to slow. The IMF has forecast that China's economy will grow somewhere in the range of 3 to 3.5% this year, and perhaps in the mid-4s next year. I think that may be a tad optimistic, but probably not wildly out of proportion. But the key point is that the less economic growth there is, the more temptation there may be for China's leaders to rely upon nationalism and repression to maintain their grip on society. And that will put stress on the US-China relationship. And looking at the US-China relationship, I think that, you know, there's been a bit of a whipsaw effect for those of us who watch it every day. You know, there was a while when it seemed like things were careening out of control. And then 2 weeks ago, President Xi and President Biden spent 3 hours together, and there were pictures of them smiling, shaking hands, having what appeared to be a fairly constructive conversation. And so it's been a bit hard to get a sense of where things are. My own view is that we are not too close to the edge or to the risk of uncontrolled escalation. I think that policy officials in both Washington and Beijing have a fair degree of confidence in their capacity to manage the relationship. And I think that President Xi and President Biden both personally have a high degree of confidence in themselves, but also in each other to be able to manage the relationship if and when it becomes necessary for them to step in. And I thought it was telling, for example, that President Biden in his press conference after his meeting with President Xi in Bali, he identified his greatest concern as a misunderstanding about the intentions of each side's actions. In other words, he didn't identify conflicting interest as the source of greatest concern to him. He identified a concern about miscalculations born out of a lack of understanding of the intentions of each side's actions. And that should tell us something. And I think that neither side really sees profit in allowing the situation to spiral out of control or for tensions to escalate significantly beyond current levels. And so the proposition that I would put to you all and leave to Susan to respond to, but also to all the members of our audience is it possible that after several years of the slope of the relationship being on a pretty sharply downward trajectory, that things will begin to flatten for the coming year and beyond? And particularly as we look to the fact that President Xi likely will travel to the United States in the fourth quarter of next year to attend the APEC leaders meeting in San Francisco, does this provide sort of a one-year bookend to test the proposition of whether it's possible to stabilize the relationship? I would struggle to make the case that we should expect a significant improvement in the relationship. In order for there to be an improvement, we would need to either find ways to resolve existing problems, to agree to prevent the emergence of future problems, or to build a positive agenda that could dilute some of the existing sources of tension in the relationship that are not going to be going away anytime soon. So the hypothesis that I'm putting in front of you is that we will see the slope of the relationship flatten considerably, but not necessarily improve, but also not continue to fall in a precipitous manner. Because at the end of the day, I think leaders in both countries are confronting some pretty daunting challenges. Neither leader wants to be seen as bowing to pressure from the other. At the same time, neither seems to see profit in allowing tensions to escalate significantly beyond current levels. And this is the zone at which the US-China relationship is currently operating, and I anticipate will continue to operate for the coming months through the end of next year.
Thank you, Ryan, for that excellent overview of where you think the relationship is. Before I'm going to turn over to Susan, I want to let our audience know that if you have a question, please post your question to the chat. Identify yourself and specify to whom you're posing your question to. Susan.
Well, thank you so much, Yawei, and thank you to both the Carter Center and to the U.S.-China Heartland Association for convening this meeting, which I too, like Ryan, very much value, and hope we'll hear some of the comments and opinions from our colleagues and comrades in the greater Kansas City region and who are listening in here. I really want to salute Ryan for making a prediction. I think predictions are very difficult to make, especially about the future, I guess, as Yogi Berra once said, and especially maybe about US-China relations and where they're going over the next year or two. I guess I agree with Ryan that what we saw in Bali between the two presidents was kind of a realization that escalating tensions were becoming maybe increasingly dangerous and maybe difficult to stem. And I think that was in part also brought home to the two presidents in a way by concerns that were expressed by the leaders of other countries who they've been seeing and meeting with over the course of the last couple of months, which have been a pretty busy period for international leader type meetings and summits. And I think other countries were starting to get increasingly concerned about what they saw maybe as the inability of the US and China as the two biggest economies in the world and presumed global leaders and global weighty powers to halt the downward spiral in their relations. And they were worried increasingly that it was going to engulf the entire international system and their own countries. And to some extent, you know, we do see that in the US-China geopolitical competition as it's unfolding, particularly in the economic realm, but also in other realms, and we can talk about that. I think for many world leaders looking out at the landscape of the globe, you know, they see a lot of things that are in flux and they feel a lot of strains. And I think the most obvious huge challenge we face is in Europe right now with Russia's shocking invasion of Ukraine, and the sense I think that people are getting that this is not going to end anytime soon. Although the Ukrainians have obviously done a valiant job of stemming the Russian tide, but it doesn't appear to be over yet. And this is obviously affecting global markets in food and energy and bringing special pressure on the developing world. And many in the developing world, of course, were already facing strains from the pandemic, especially also from climate change and other woes. So I think now we need to see whether this kind of growing realization among sort of leaders as they're starting to meet in person again will have enough of add enough pressure to the US-China relationship to form some kind of a basis for an improvement, in addition to the impetus felt by the two leaders themselves about these tensions. You know, I agree that both governments actually are dealing with difficult domestic situations. Ryan talked a lot about what the government in Beijing, from the Chinese leadership perspective, what they're facing. I think, you know, both sides have these difficult domestic situations. They see the other side as a threat to their national security, and they've lost trust in the other side. And these are factors, the domestic and then the bilateral relationship, that sort of intertwine and play on one another in the current environment, and do, I think, contribute to the escalation that we see. In the short to medium term, you know, I think the things that will make a reset, so-called, difficult include, on the US side, this kind of bipartisan political consensus in Washington around a pretty hostile policy to China. And the problem that because of political divides, it's almost impossible for the US to take any actions that could be painted, you know, by one side or the other of the political divide as conciliatory or a compromise. So I think that makes traditional diplomacy, which requires, you know, generally requires compromise through negotiation, very difficult to undertake right now in Washington with China. And we also see, of course, this clear trend toward trade protectionism in the US that's going to continue to create frictions with trading partners, especially China, in addition to the export controls and national security-based actions that have been taken on the part of the US and that are very popular still in Washington. I think there are numerous issues that Washington's also interested in focusing on in the new Congress. We'll see probably an investigation into the origins of the COVID pandemic, a major speaker-led delegation to Taiwan, and now probably we'll see increasing rhetoric around and concerns about protests and resultant crackdowns in China related to the recent domestic unrest, et cetera. And this will all continue to seriously strain, I think, US-China ties from the Washington side. On the Chinese side, these domestic stability problems that have flared up over the last weekend, we still don't know where they're going, but that will not help in sort of calming US-China tensions. Ryan mentioned the floundering economy, in part due to these COVID lockdowns. Extreme sensitivity over Taiwan continues, and there's just been a range of tit-for-tat actions which are likely to continue from the Chinese side and that will challenge the notion of a reset, I think, in the near term. But I do think that this Bali meeting and other summit diplomacy shows that both China and the US recognize the need for more predictability in the global economy and in geopolitics and international governance. And so that could, as Ryan mentioned, serve to sort of flatten the downward spiral that we've been on over the next year. But I think it's also going to be difficult to stabilize in an environment where each side blames the other almost completely for the current tensions. And so in that case, each side is refusing to take so-called the first step, thinks the other side needs to do something. And so it's kind of hard to see in that scenario what the basis can be for sort of a reset. I hope that the tensions can flatten and that they can make a determination that stability is worth kind of compromising slightly on this blame game that we've been involved in. But I think that's what would need to happen to sort of flatten the downward trajectory over the next year. The discussions of cooperation on climate change and on health issues, maybe we can get into this in the question and answer period, but to me, it doesn't appear that these are going far enough to serve as a basis for improvement either. And I think personally that serious discussions about the global economy, the macro financial situation, trade ties in the global trading system, including the technology tensions, are the place where the US and China should focus their bilateral discussion efforts, given the current situation, given global concerns, and given the problems that both governments face domestically. But so far, this seems to be a bridge too far, I think, for Washington especially. And I note that there has been increasing discussion in the US and in China too about how some of these conversations might best be had at the subnational level, which could be helpful. And so maybe we can talk about that in the discussion in the question session as well. How can subnational entities get involved in trying to bridge some of these important economic issues for both sides? I mean, I think the other issue that really needs to be carefully managed and addressed proactively is Taiwan. Certainly from the beginning of US-China relations in the 1970s, this has been the consistent third rail in US-China relations. It's well advertised and well known. And for 40 years, we've seen the incredible success of our One China policy in every respect, including most dramatically Taiwan's incredible progress. So what is the cost benefit analysis of jeopardizing this policy now? Not many people talk about that, the cost benefit analysis of our approach to Taiwan, but I think that is the question that should be asked and should be honestly assessed from the perspective of U.S. interests in the both medium and long term. And maybe I'll just stop there, Yawei.
Thanks. We have a very urgent question. I think that's very perfect for Ryan to answer. Is the Taiwan's midterm election? Even though they're local elections, but still, do you think it will have any impact on the cross-strait relationship, and of course, in turn, whether that will also affect U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I'll offer a perspective, but I welcome Susan or you, Yawei, to counter it or challenge it. My own view is that the results of the recent local elections in Taiwan shouldn't be overinterpreted for implications to cross-strait or U.S.-China relations, that they were driven largely by local factors. These are mayors and magistrates that are running for office. And when mayors run for office, they talk about public works, they talk about education, they talk about local issues. And on that basis, the KMT candidates outperformed the DPP candidates by a pretty significant margin in much of Taiwan. To the extent that it influences the nature of cross-strait relations, I think it should give people in Beijing a bit more confidence in the credibility of their own narrative, that there is still a path available for a non-violent resolution to cross-strait differences, and that with time, patience, steadiness, and foresight and wisdom, that Beijing can find a way forward. Now, will that have much of a bearing on the direction of U.S.-China relations? Probably not in the near term, but we'll see.
Susan, you have anything to add to this question?
Well, I would just say that we saw something very similar happen in the last Taiwan midterm election back in 2018, I think it was. And then we saw that, that slump in the midterm elections for the DPP ruling party was reversed at the 2-year later presidential election period. So that just shows you how sort of this pattern, as Ryan said, local issues tend not to translate to the national level election, which tends to be much more focused on sort of mainland and cross-strait issues than these local elections do. We see that pattern repeating. So I think it may give mainland China a bit more confidence in the sort of life cycle of the other party in Taiwan, the KMT party, but it probably won't translate too directly to the national level elections coming up in 2 years in January 2024.
Just a quick response to what Susan talked about, the KMT's big victory in Taiwan's local election in 2018, and then it's a drastic loss in the 2020 presidential election. In between, of course, there is the Hong Kong drama, which played a very important role. I think the fact that DPP has lost so badly, at least it's an indirect, if not a direct reflection of the voters, thinking that maybe DPP has gone too far in almost inviting violence from the China side. Maybe this is a simplistic and naive, interpretation, but I think it does, tell us, as Ryan said, the credibility of China's narrative is that, really you need to work on the people in Taiwan. Just pay less attention to what's going on here in the U.S. if you really want a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Now, there's one thorny issue I guess we all have to address, and Kissinger in his book on China, toward the end, I think at basically the conclusion, he said Americans are not going to be Americans if they don't care how the people of a government are being treated by the government, and also where the power of that government is being bestowed. I didn't check the Chinese version whether that part of the conclusion was taken out. But in terms of flattening of the relationship, or
Oh, Yawei, I think
You went on to mute.
so the flattening of the relationship or resetting of the relationship, how U.S. is going to deal with issues, thorny issues, very bothersome issues in Taiwan, but more importantly in Xinjiang, in Tibet, as well as in Hong Kong. How this issue is going to be dealt with by the U.S. so that you can really, can these issues and the relationship be separated? I guess that's my question. Susan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, I think that the issue of the Chinese government's treatments of its own people has been a very salient one throughout the U.S.-China relationship ever since the normalization, and in fact, was at great issue during the process of the normalization on the U.S. side. And I think it certainly was something that was incredibly salient after the 1989 Tiananmen Square events, and will continue to be a very prominent issue in U.S.-China relations. I mean, the entire time that I've been involved in managing the U.S.-China relationship, the U.S. determination to speak out and to criticize China's human rights performance, to try to proactively impact it and move it in a better direction, has been at the center of everything that we've been doing with China. But of course, it's a very complicated relationship, and we have a ton of other interests. And I guess I would say that I think that these issues will never be swept under the carpet in U.S.-China relations. They'll always be quite prominent. One thing that bothers me about the current U.S. policy toward China is this line that we have now from the Biden administration that says, we can't change China. We have to deal with the China that we have. And the implication is we're going to just forget about sort of our, attention being paid to sort of governance issues inside China. I think that's frankly a mistake. I think as China steps out onto the global stage, it's going to have more influence on all countries in the world, just as the US has influence on all countries in the world. And I think that we do have space to try to affect these processes and China's outlook in these areas, and we need to not give up on that. We need to not lose faith with the Chinese people, and we need to not lose faith with trying to steer China toward a more compliant with international sensibilities and standards on human rights positions. And I think we should not be giving up on that.
Right.
Yawei, may I just offer one additional thought on top of everything that Susan said, which makes perfect sense to me. I think that, as Susan said, that human rights have always been at the center of the U.S.-China relationship. There hasn't ever really been a time when it hasn't been at the center of the relationship. And I don't see any reason why that will change going forward, particularly in the near term. The question is, what is the appropriate or the most effective blend between the various elements that we use to address human rights issues with China? And that's where there's been some evolution over time. There's sort of, in my mind at least, there are three ways of addressing human rights issues. One is sort of privately and directly with the Chinese. One is publicly. And the other is finding ways to coordinate with allies and partners and like-minded friends to provide sort of a rate or stereo effect so that the Chinese hear from multiple angles the strength of concerns. And I think that we will adjust between those three components as time goes forward, and depending upon the leadership in the United States. But we will never grow mute on these issues because, as you said, Yawei, I mean, it's just sort of a part of who we are as a country. But the other thought that I would offer is that it's easy. I find that it's easy for people to feel sort of defeatist or deeply sort of pessimistic about the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship. And we can all, without much imagination, make up scenarios whereby the relationship continues to deteriorate rapidly. But if you look back at the history of the US-China relationship, I mean, it has never traveled on a straight line for very long. You know, from the deep estrangement during the early years of the Cold War to the cautious opening with Nixon and Kissinger, sort of building optimism through Deng's ascension and reform and opening, to deep disillusionment after Tiananmen, to sort of this thickening interdependence in the first 15, 16 years of this century, to now, you know, all this discussion about decoupling, social, economic decoupling. The sine waves of the relationship have always been going up and down, and it's just worth bearing in mind. I don't think we've arrived at some terminal point in history whereby from this point forward, we're only going to be moving on a linear trajectory.
Thanks, Ryan. We all know that Kevin McCarthy said, you know, once he becomes the speaker, he's going to visit Taiwan. Susan mentioned this. This is a looming crisis. So my question to Ryan is, if you're approached by a think tank from China saying, you know, how should China actually react to such a visit? What would be your advice?
Well, I haven't been asked for advice from Chinese think tanks about how to react, but if I ever was, you know, I think that they have sort of they have a challenge. They can either be too hot, too cold, or just right in their response. And if they're too hot, you know, overreacting to a potential visit by Kevin McCarthy and a delegation, they will push Taiwan further away. They will sort of undermine their own long-term objectives in service of placating domestic sentiment. If they are too cool and sort of indifferent to McCarthy's visit and sort of treat him as a short, ill-tempered troublemaker, then they sort of risk moral hazard of creating a perception that it's okay for others to continue down the current path. So what is that sweet spot between being too hot and too cold? I'm not going to give the Chinese advice on how to respond to a potential visit by Speaker McCarthy, but I think that they need to bear in mind sort of what their long-term objectives are and how their reactions to a visit will affect them.
Yeah, if they ask me for my advice, I would say just ignore it, right? Why do you care so much, you know? But Susan, from the State Department, you know, wearing your old hat, what would you say? You know, basically, how can we make this not sort of a reincarnation of Speaker Pelosi's visit? You know, just, you know, so short a time after the August unfortunate visit.
Well, I mean, sitting in the State Department, of course, I mean, what you would hope we would be trying to do is to persuade Kevin McCarthy not to do this, because I think it will be seen in Beijing as a deliberate provocation, especially so soon after the Pelosi visit. And I don't think that the US government, in terms of its one China policy, in terms of our stated, you know, approach of having unofficial relations with Taiwan, benefits much from a Kevin McCarthy visit, you know, so soon after so many other congressional visits. And I think there's probably a significant downside that's going to be realized from such a visit. But I think, you know, the most difficult part of handling this kind of an issue, probably both for Beijing and Washington, is to handle the sort of public narrative and the public pressure and the public opinion side of it. Because what we don't want, what we really don't want to see, is the people in the United States and the people in China starting to regard one another as enemies. I mean, it's one thing for our two governments to spar and trade barbs and this kind of thing, but we really want to avoid as much as possible the growing enmity between the two publics. And I think this kind of a visit by Kevin McCarthy is not going to serve that objective very, very well.
Thank you. Ryan, in your initial remarks, you mentioned President Biden's press conference in Bali after the summit. You mentioned about the misunderstanding which may lead to miscalculation. You know, Biden, of all recent American presidents, he's the one that has, I think, the best knowledge about where China is and where China is going to go. You probably remember when he was campaigning in early 2020, he said, to think of China stealing our lunch, that's not going to happen because China has so many problems, corruption problems, problems in the South China Sea, problem in the western part of China. But it seems after he moved into the White House, that perception of China has changed drastically. Now he's starting to address that issue. To couple this with a question, of a global affairs director of a university is, how do we better understand China? How do we teach the undergrad students that, as Susan said, China is not the enemy, even though there are so many differences between the two countries, but the two countries may be able to work out their differences, but remain partners, in their global quest for peace and prosperity.
That's a big question, Yawei. I'll get us started, but I hope that you guys will carry us forward. Look, I think that the starting point is to help build a frame of reference for Americans to think about the US-China relationship going forward. And what I mean by that is that the last two times that the United States has had a great power competition has been World War II and the Cold War. In World War II, we prevailed militarily over Axis powers. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed and we were allowed to prevail in that instance. I'm unconvinced that either of those options are available to us in the current competition between the United States and China. In other words, if we harbor illusions that we will prevail on a battlefield against China, I think that we just misunderstand the nature of China. I can't imagine a scenario short of sort of a humanity extinction level event where either side would surrender to the other. We both have just sort of national identities of ourselves as singular powers. And so, and beyond that, it would just be devastating to the world if we ever found ourselves in conflict with each other. So, let's avoid that. And then I don't think that the nature of China allows us to build strategies upon expectations of future collapse of China either. And so what does that mean? It means that we're going to have to accept the fact that we're not going anywhere, that the Chinese aren't going anywhere. And if we're going to address the challenges that both people inside the United States and China confront, we're going to have to find a way to coordinate our respective actions to do so effectively. And the recent record of our baleful response to COVID-19 should provide sort of a crystal clear example of what the world looks like when the United States and China are incapable of coordinating respective actions to contend with challenges that kill citizens in both of our countries. And that's the starting point that I would hope we can begin to build a narrative around, sort of understanding the nature of the relationship. And this doesn't mean that we need to like Chinese behavior or be sympathetic to the goals of the Chinese Communist Party. It's just sort of an acceptance of the reality that we live in. And then begin to build clear-eyed policies and strategies from that point with the recognition of where our interests lie. And to me, the function of a government is to protect the safety, the health, and promote the prosperity of its people. And what type of relationship with China best enables us to achieve those objectives for our people? That's where I hope that we can start the conversation. And from there, it begins to become more clear what type of relationship will be necessary for us with China in order to achieve those minimum requirements. And also how the United States can more effectively compete with China in areas where we have tensions and goals that are in tension with each other.
Thanks, Ryan. So there is actually a question saying, how can the US media be persuaded not to heighten tensions? My response to that, if you look at the Chinese media and how the Chinese media, both the official and the social media, portray the US, I think because we'll be monitoring this and putting out newsletters, China's media is far worse in reporting what is going on, which is leading to what I think is a very important dimension. I call that the clash of misperceptions. The US side, there is this fear, vibrant fear that China is upsetting the international rule-based order. China is penetrating American campuses. China is undermining American democracy. Therefore, even in the wake of the war in Ukraine, China still poses the existential threat to the US. On the China side, I think the perception is US is in decline. You look at the January 6th riot, US cannot even control its pandemic and the rising racial tensions. So the time and momentum, 时与时 is on our side and 东升西降. So I think this kind of clash of perception is going to be very dangerous, and leaders on both sides. I agree with Ryan that President Biden has pinpointed a very important point. Susan, back to your earlier question on subnational dialogue. I went to the Nixon Library Foundation for the 50th anniversary of Nixon's trip. I also went to Idaho to attend, the release of the book, the role of agricultural cooperation between US and China. At both functions, I've seen no local leader, not the mayor, not the governor, not the lieutenant governor. I think in Yawei Liu, not even sort of the state university official coming to the function. So who showed up? Majority of them are Chinese Americans who have enjoyed, the opening up of the relationship, and then ex-government officials, some business representatives. So do you agree with me when you say we should, intensify subnational level government? Is that even at the local level, there is the fear that if they're going to do something related to China or US-China relations, they will be accused of being fellow travelers of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's not something that they want to do. And how are you going to respond to that? Susan, you're on mute.
Yeah, this is the danger of the sort of mutual overreaction in this tit for tat cycle. And I think what is most distressing to me, in the context of this so-called competition between the US and China, I mean, we've always been involved in a competition. We just didn't talk about it in those terms, but it was more of a positive sum competition. I mean, sometimes we have differences and we need to manage those. And we've had a lot of, frictions over the years, but in general, a lot of areas were seen to be positive sum competition. But now we really do talk about the competition in zero sum terms. And I think this cannot help but lead to this kind of upcycle of sort of regarding each other as enemies. It's sort of a loss of confidence on the part of our two governments. We see our kind of, Ryan mentioned that each of these two countries, the US and China, have very singular identities in terms of their national place in the world. And we now see, both of us, that this national identity is somehow threatened by the other. And I think that's a very dangerous place for us to be. And I think it's a wrong place for us to be, but it is sort of stoked by the sort of public narratives on both sides. As Yawei mentioned, it's stoked by the state media on the Chinese side, partly from a place of, frankly, paranoia and defensiveness on the part of the Chinese government. They're trying to build themselves up in the eyes of their people and add to their legitimacy. And this is one way that they've decided to do it, which is very unhealthy. On our side in the US, I think we're struggling a bit with our national identity and our post-Cold War or post-Cold War purpose. We're feeling a little bit lacking in confidence, maybe because of some of our domestic issues that we've been through lately. And so we are also looking to pump ourselves up. And this is a very destructive kind of discourse. And certainly a zero-sum competition between the US and China is not going to work out well for either one of us or anyone else.
So there's a question related to the importance of China being a market. In terms of technological decoupling, in terms of the trade war, my sense is always China is playing a reactionary game. China is playing defensive. China has never initiated any sanctions on the US. And I remember in the early days of the trade war, there's someone from China saying, we have weapons, 杀手锏, we can stop buying soybeans. If that doesn't work, we can stop buying Boeing planes. If it doesn't work, we can stop, buying Apple products. China has never done that. I mean, a series of sanctions by the U.S. and most recently on the chip industry, kind of like a nuclear option. So here is, do you agree that China has been playing a game of more of defensive in nature? Secondly, will this pressure continue, and how, if push comes to shovel, how China is going to react to that? And third is what role the U.S. business sector is going to play. You all read that Hank Greenberg and other business leaders, they met with the Chinese delegation. This kind of business approach seems to be working. Should we place too much hope? We know the business sector has played a very important role. China joined the WTO. China's, the trade surplus and all of that. Has that role been significantly reduced, or this will still be central to a stabilization of the relationship? Maybe Ryan, you'll go first.
I was hoping you were going to ask Susan first.
I can go first. I mean, Yawei, I think, frankly, this whole issue of globalization and the international trading system is on the discussion block, and we have some people listening in who I'm sure have a lot to say about this issue. But I mean, there is a backlash in the U.S. clearly against globalization, and China is a big part of that backlash against globalization and comes into that conversation in some ways fair, in some ways not fair. But I think this is a much bigger issue than U.S.-China relations. And all countries now are rethinking the relationship between their sort of global exposure in their economy and their national security. And how far this is going to go is not yet, I don't think, clear. It seems that there may be some thinking starting to emerge that we may be going too far. Certainly, U.S. business has been on the defensive on this issue, and so has been kind of loath to stick its head up and try to defend globalization and the China element of globalization. And I think that we will see the pendulum swing back at some point. It's a question of really whether, we need to see a sort of a big economic downturn in order to have that happen, or we need pressure from other countries, or where is it going to come from? But I think, in the US, we're really having a big rethink about our, exposure to the rest of the world in our trade. And we're talking about resilience, which is needed for sure. We're talking about reshoring manufacturing and making sure that we have enough in defense industrial base, et cetera. So some of this has to do with China, but a lot of it is just more of a, as I said earlier, kind of a defensive reaction maybe to things that are going on in the world that go far beyond China.
Right. Yeah, I think that the discussions about decoupling have gotten over caffeinated. I think that there's a pretty hard ceiling on how much decoupling is possible. It's not a practical reality that the United States and Chinese economies will completely separate from each other. This year alone, the United States and China will trade more in goods and services than in any previous year in the history of the U.S.-China relationship. So when you read stories about decoupling, just bear that in mind. It's not happening in practical terms. It is happening in certain specific areas related to high technology. At the same time, I don't think that the business community is going to provide the bulwark for the relationship that it did perhaps in the early 2000s. China, when it was facing pressure over permanent national trade relations, it relied upon the business community to lobby Congress on behalf of their own self-interest. And that's not going to happen either. And so if anyone in Beijing holds out hope that the business community will be the savior of the U.S.-China relationship, I think that they're misreading the moment. So that means that that there will continue to be a pretty deep interdependence between the United States and Chinese economies, out of self-interest. Reflecting the fact that China is one of the largest growth engines of the global economy, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future, even as they grow at a slower rate from a broader base. But the level of growth and investment by American companies in China, I think, clearly already has cooled considerably. And as long as we remain in this moment where zero COVID is sort of the dominant feature of the day, I expect that will continue.
Obviously, as Ryan said, we should be aware not to read too much into the local elections in Taiwan. Should people read too much into the recent protests that Susan mentioned in the earlier remarks?
I think people will read a lot into the demonstrations, because I think this will be something that will be featured prominently in the American media narrative and probably the international media narrative. I mean, we just will have to watch and see. I mean, clearly people are extremely frustrated in China with all of the mixed messages, the lockdowns, which are so draconian, way beyond what would be reasonable by any standard, I think. And so we'll just have to see, how it goes forward and what the kind of national government's reaction is. I don't think it's unfortunate that the Chinese government got itself into this situation right at the time when the height of the flu season is upon us, because there's really going to be probably a pretty severe outbreak now, and it's hard to lift restrictions when you're it would have been good to do it probably last spring and try to grapple with it slowly and incrementally, but now I think it's going to be tricky no matter what they do. They're between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I can't see them tolerating mass internal unrest, though, and so that'll be a dramatic story if it unfolds, and it won't help U.S.-China relations.
Yeah, I was just surprised over the weekend, when all these videos of the protests in Shanghai and elsewhere, all of us can access them over WeChat. I thought they should have been deleted a long time ago, whether it's a weekend or whether, there are too many of them, or maybe it's a tactic, to allow people, to release their anger, because it reminds me of what happened, when Li Wenliang died, during the early period of the pandemic. Susan, you mentioned pressure from other countries. To what extent can we credit this pressure from other countries in sort of setting up a reset of U.S.-China relationship? We all noticed that the German chancellor was the first to visit China, just days after the party congress, against the advice of many of his fellow European leaders. But while in Beijing, he was able to exact from President Xi Jinping that China is solidly against any use of nuclear weapons. Will there be more European and Asian leaders, who are going to do the same as what Scholz had done, so that pressuring the USA, to at least to relax a little bit on the three-pronged offensive against China, invest, align, and compete?
Well, I think it depends on so many different external factors, but I think what we're seeing is that the costs of Russia's, incredibly appalling invasion of Ukraine, the costs of that coming home to roost in Europe are really starting to be felt now. And so that gives European leaders basically a different kind of a calculation as they look out on the options that they have before them than sort of what we're facing here in the US, where we feel the effects of that conflict much less. I think that's one factor. I also think, probably the October 7th announcement by the US about the export bans on semiconductor sales to China which, we were trying to coordinate with our friends and allies around the world, but then decided that we had to go ahead and announce that. I mean, I think that also kind of brought up short a lot of our partners around the world, including in Europe and Asia, to start thinking, much harder maybe, and maybe more sort of from the standpoint of their own interests about sort of what's this going to mean for their kind of economic futures, and what's this going to mean for their relationship with China. And I think it's quite clear that most other countries do not feel that they are in a position to really kind of proactively alienate China in the way that I think it has been apparent to them that the U.S. has been willing to do. Now, whether that's what the U.S. is trying to do or not, I think the Biden administration would say that's not what they're trying to do. But, starting back under the Trump administration, there was a lot of pretty aggressive rhetoric against China. And I think most countries have now, maybe after a couple of years of this, come around to believing that they can't really follow the U.S. down that path that the U.S. seems to be thinking that it can afford to go down. They just have a different calculation of what they can afford with respect to Beijing.
Thanks. I think we're getting close to the end of our discussion. So I will ask each of you to respond to one question, putting our shoes, our feet into the shoes of the Chinese leaders. I guess for Ryan is, to what extent China can change its position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We know that China has not condemned Russia. We also know China has refrained itself from supplying, helping Russia's war effort. And now, of course, Xi Jinping has forced Putin to acknowledge that China has questions and concerns. And of course, Xi Jinping also has gone public, basically saying, no, you're not going to use technical nuclear weapons. Beyond that, are there anything else that China can do? Can China actually play an active role in getting so-called peace talk to go between the two? And for Susan, is on the climate. We know the personal relationship between Senator Kerry and Xi Jinping are very important. We have heard that Kerry may be leaving this post, one of the pillars of the stabilization of U.S.-China relationship, may be gone early next year. So how China can really work sort of to the rhythm of what U.S. is doing on the climate control climate. So maybe Susan will go first and Ryan go second, and then we wrap it up.
Great. Well, I did say earlier in my comments that I think that the pillar of the climate change cooperation is positive, but it's not going to be enough to form a kind of a basis for, calming tensions between the U.S. and China. And that's because really, what we've seen in the U.S.-China climate so-called cooperation over the years is that the two are really in the business of pressuring one another to do things that we don't want to do. And that is a hard basis for improvement in relations. I mean, right now, the main sort of push from the US on China is to have China make an additional concrete specific pledge on methane emissions, which China has not so far been willing to do. And the Chinese main push on the US is around this climate finance for the developing countries. And so I think these are both, so you see that it's not really cooperation, it's mutual pressuring to do things we don't want to do. And that in the past has, been a sufficient basis for cooperation on, or so-called cooperation on climate change, but I'm not sure in the current bilateral environment that it's going to really be enough to overcome the frictions in these areas that we also see. And there are a lot of frictions on climate change between the US and China right now on green technology and in this kind of trade and export ban area, and probably more to come on that. So I think, John Kerry has managed to develop a productive, definitely diplomatic relationship with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua in China, and their diplomacy and their constant contacts have been one of the sort of main channels of communication in the diplomatic realm since those channels were basically cut off during COVID and have been sort of in abeyance now. But I think it's not going to be enough to sustain the relationship, I'll put it that way. Now, maybe if we can get a multilateral framework going in which other countries could both, pressure the US and China and have a more plurilateral dynamic that would sort of take away from this bilateral sort of haranguing of each other, that might be helpful on climate. And that's probably what I would try to propose if John Kerry indeed is gonna leave his post, but we'll have to see how that develops.
Very quickly, Susan, when you were at the State Department, they were joint, clean coal research centers. Do you think, like, as a small token, these joint centers could be revived?
I mean, that would be great if they could be, and that's what people who work on climate issues would like to see. But I just think politically in the US, it's very hard to see how that could be palatable in the current environment. So, there are lots of details and reasons why it should be palatable. There are all kinds of agreements about IP, et cetera, but the idea of collaborative scientific research has fallen pretty far out of favor now in Washington. I mean, and that's something we should, certainly remedy, because that on something that's as important to both our peoples as, stopping climate emissions, we should be researching together. But for some reason now that's become much more difficult than it was in the past.
All right, Ryan, you're gonna wrap this up.
All right. Well, let me wrap up most importantly by saying thank you, Yawei and Min and Susan. It's been such a pleasure to be with you. On your question, Yawei, if I'm confident of one thing in China, it's that Xi Jinping is unsentimental, and that he will always act in accordance with what he determines to be his own and China's own interests. And I don't think that China's interests are well served by what's happening in Ukraine. I also don't think that that the Chinese leadership wants to do the United States or the West any favors in reigning in Russia. But China is going to go after its own interest. It's going to want to preserve space to be the partner of first choice for Ukraine in rebuilding when the war ends and the rebuilding begins. I think China will want to preserve its access and influence in Europe, and particularly as Xi Jinping returns to the world stage and is engaging more with European counterparts, I think he will hear more directly, more forcefully, and more consistently the expectations that they have of China's role in Ukraine going forward. So that's not a very clear answer to a very simple question that you asked, Yawei, but that's sort of the general direction I would anticipate China to travel.
And Yawei, if I could just add, I think it's
Sure.
really important that the Chinese cease to portray things that are happening in Ukraine as the fault of the US and NATO. And I think there was some improvement in the public propaganda lines in China on that issue coming after the Bali meeting. And I think it's worth, keeping an eye on that and watching to see if that's sustained, because that would be pretty significant.
Yeah, I certainly hope, Susan, as you mentioned earlier, these external factors, plus the domestic issues will coalesce, to pressure the leaders in both capitals to rethink and reset the relationship in 2023. Because, by the time we go to 2024 with a presidential election, I think it will be not very easy to stabilize the relationship. So I would like to thank both Susan Thornton and Ryan Hass for your excellent participation and sharing your view with our audience today. I also would like to thank U.S. Heartland China Association and also our joint supporters, the Ford Foundation, for supporting this. And of course, there's also Luz Foundation that is a supporter of the Heartland Association. Thank you all. And for those that are here maybe there are a few in China, so have a good night. And for those in the US, have a good afternoon. We'll talk to you in the new year. when the relationship is improved, hopefully.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.